Okay, thank you everyone for joining us today. I think we'll get started in just a moment.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. We are delighted to see so many people joining the webinar. My name is Sarah Zimmerman, and I'm the Program and Policy Director here at the Safe Routes to School National Partnership. On behalf of the Safe Routes to School National Partnership, as well as our partners at the Voices for Healthy Kids Initiative, we are very pleased to welcome you to today's webinar on uncovering implicit bias. We are hosting this webinar together with the Voices for Healthy Kids Initiative as part of our work on equity and on anti-racism. We're looking forward to the webinar helping us to deepen our understanding of how implicit bias affects all of the work that we do to make change, whether that's through interpersonal interactions, through our organizational work environments, through our campaign advocacy, or our policy work. And we're really glad that everyone is participating in this webinar and joining us on this journey to understand and address implicit bias with the larger goal of using this learning to improve health equity and to take on racism and other systems of oppression. Now I am going to introduce our presenters for today's webinar. Our friends from We-Collab will be presenting this webinar. We-Collab is a social change organization that has the mission of accelerating social change through collaboration. We-Collab creates space for individuals and institutions to work on solutions to some of the most challenging problems that face society today. On today's webinar, we will be hearing from Dr. Bryant, who is Associate Professor at Morehouse College and a lead trainer for the National Training Institute on Race and Equity. We'll also be hearing from Niobli Armah, who is the founder of We-Collab, and Samia Mirza, the Managing Director at We-Collab. With that, let me go ahead and hand it over to Niobli to get us started.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and so glad to be talking to everyone today. I can't think of a better way to start the Tuesday after Memorial Day than talking about implicit bias. And so thank you for everyone that's joining. And I actually want to just take a second to do a level set about how we're going to spend the next hour. Implicit bias trainings typically can occur over a 3 or 4 hour or full day session. And so our goal today is really to open up the discussion and to just tease some of the topics. Usually these conversations happen in person, but we wanted to make sure that that we're giving the field the opportunity to even engage around this. And so again, we're going to really introduce some topics, and at the end of the call, we'll talk about how you can follow up and ask questions. But I did want to just level set that before we get started. Also what I want to do, because I believe in virtual learning, and I know some of you are on the phone or you're doing dishes or you're working on your report, and we really want you to bring your full attention to the discussion. I mean, implicit bias is important, and so this is kind of my call to action for attention. And so in order to kind of check in on folks, those who are able, if you could just put in the chat box where you're calling from, I just want to make sure folks are out there. And so if you could put your city in there or the town you're in, just to check in where everyone is tuning in today for this webinar. And I'm going to wait a second just to see, okay, San Antonio, nice, Philly, New Jersey, San Francisco, D.C., Oregon, Columbia, Virginia, New Jersey, Riverside. Oh, this is awesome. Maryland, Boston, Los Angeles, Seattle, North Dakota, Savannah. Wow. Waco. Yay for Waco. Glad you're here. Awesome. Okay, well, you know what? Thank you so much for engaging with us. We really appreciate it. As we said, we believe in virtual learning, like these environments. It's the best we have with a field that's spread out across the country. And so we want to make sure we take advantage of it. Here in a moment, I'm going to introduce you to Dr. Bryant from Morehouse. And I just want to say a few words about Dr. Marks before he comes on. Dr. Marks has been working on implicit bias for over a decade. More recently, one of the ways I met Dr. Marks was through some of the work he was doing with the White House through their My Brother's Keeper initiative and training police chiefs across the country. And so what I want to say at the very beginning of this discussion, that implicit bias is not about name blaming or shaming, but it's about calling out what we all experience. And I can't think of a better person that has helped us to have these conversations. And so I'm getting ready to turn it over to Dr. Marks. Afterwards, you're going to hear from me again to kind of give it context to some of the work you're doing. But again, I want to thank everyone, and thank you, Sarah, and Voices for Healthy Kids and Safer Schools. But Dr. Marks, go ahead and take it away.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm sort of just getting a bit settled. I'm in travel, so if you hear noise in the background, please forgive me as I transition. But as we begin, we're going to have to be a bit just a bit flexible because I need to pull up the slides here. Actually, I'm going to ask a quick favor. Could you all give me 2 minutes and then come back, just because I'm going. I just need 2 minutes. Could you just give me 2 minutes, Niobli? Is that possible? Give me 2 minutes, and I'm sorry.
Like I said, we're flexible. So this is what I want to do to kick off the discussion. We all have like notions of what implicit bias means. So if everyone could, or not everyone, those of you who are willing, if you could drop in the chat box some of your expectations for today's discussion, based off what you think implicit bias is and where you are in your work. If you could just put what you hope to get out of the discussion today or what you hope to learn from, and I will share those with some of you all and make sure that we weave that into the content that you're going to get today. All righty. Seeing some of the first questions, waiting for them to come through. Just general expectations about today. Okay, awesome. I see the first one, exercises to train your brain to identify implicit bias. Perfect. Deepen your understanding of implicit bias and how to impart knowledge, understanding of sharing that in others in our community. Understanding where to start, we're definitely going to help with that. Examples of well-intentioned work. Awesome. Assessments, we're definitely going to talk about an assessment you can use. There's a few easy ones online. How to address bias. Increase self-awareness. Understanding my personal bias and how I can help others become aware of it. Absolutely. Bring staff on the journey to identify and then improve. Absolutely. This is definitely about building capacity within our organizations. And so the second half of the call, we're going to touch on that. How to address implicit bias to those people and systems who deny their own biases. For sure. We'll take a couple more. And again, thank you all for interacting with us. Bringing partners who are outside of our organization on this journey. That's the hardest one, is how do you enlist people in this work and to see the value add in it. Awesome. So the second thing I want you to do, we're actually going to do some live polling software today. And so we're going to take this moment to set your phone up to be able to do that. And so I'm going to give you some instructions on a number that you can text, and this is going to actually help later in the presentation. So for our live polling, we're going to ask only a few questions today. The number you're going to text to is 22333. It's 22333. And then to open this up, this is what you need to text. And it's long, so forgive us. But you need to text SAMIAMIRZA 064 to 22333. And we're actually going to put that in the chat box so you can see it if you're on your computer. But and you can see it on the screen in front of you right now also. But it's Samia Mirza 064. Text that to 22333, and you'll be able to engage in some of the polling. Bryant, I'm doing the check-in to see if you're geared up.
Yes, I'm here.
Awesome. It's all yours.
Okay. All right. So let's go ahead and share the screen. Hold on 1 second. Hold on. 1 second. Okay. Can you all see me?
Absolutely. You're
Hello?
good to go, Bryant. Go ahead.
Is my screen coming up?
Yep, you're on slide 1, uncovering implicit bias.
Okay. Yeah, I can't see what you all are saying, but we will proceed. Sorry. So it's showing that I'm sorry. It's showing that I have control because. Okay. All right.
Bryant, we're gonna run your slides for you. All right, so just tell us
Okay.
when you want to set. We're on the first slide now.
Okay. All right. Okay. So what we like to do here is a matter of perspective. So if everyone is looking at a particular slide where it says matter of perspective, I like Samia and Niobli, when you advance the slide, just advance it really quickly. So just press the forward and backward arrows really, really, really quickly so that folks can get a sense of a perspective. Did you all do that?
Yep.
Okay. So what we want to do here, the reason that we flash that slide and we want people to take a look and they have to sort of concentrate and then tell us what they see. The reason that we do that is to demonstrate that a lot of this work is a matter of perspective. So when you look at that image, and Nobel, you can go back to it, let it sit on the screen. When two people can look at another person or the same situation and see something completely different. As a matter of fact, one person can look at another person or a situation and have an initial impression and then have what's called an aha moment. Where you're like, aha, I see the other possibility, right? Now, that aha moment may be a few seconds, a few weeks, a few days. It all depends on the situation. So when we talk about perspective taking and implicit bias, situations are key and perspectives play a critical role as well. And so on the next slide, we're going to flash another image. So Niobli, you can go to the next slide where it says, guess who's moving in next door? And here's what I like to do. I like to describe a scenario for you. Okay. Now in this scenario, imagine, you're out at work, you come home and you're checking your mail. So you're checking your mail, you come home and you come across a letter, and the letter says that a registered sex offender will be moving in next door to you. Okay. Now, for the most part, when people think of a registered sex offender, a negative feeling or emotion comes to mind. And that's pretty normal. But the question becomes, when I said that a registered sex offender was moving in next door to you, with those sort of feelings and emotions and thoughts that you had, they tap into certain biases that we may have just due to exposure. So a lot of times our biases or expectations about a particular group is a direct result of disproportionate exposure. What do I mean? So when I said to you all that a registered sex offender was moving in next door to you, how many of you all might have thought that that registered sex offender was female, if you're being completely honest? And for the most part, when we think of registered sex offenders, we don't think female, we think male. And that's a form of bias. Throughout our lifetimes, we've been overexposed to certain groups and certain traits and certain groups in certain roles. And due to that overexposure, it may lead us to have associations that in many situations can be negative. Some situations they can be positive, but nonetheless, that overexposure can lock in an association between the group and the trait, which lays the foundation for bias. So whether it's thinking registered sex offenders may be more male, thinking that NBA players are all tall, thinking that Asians are good at math, whatever the association is with a particular group, just living in society and being exposed to those associations, it could lead to us forming biases. And we all have them. So next slide. We all have biases. Okay, so whether you're male, female, young, elderly, whatever the case is, just due to living in a society where you're disproportionately exposed to certain groups and certain traits and certain groups in certain roles, biases are going to form. As human beings, we are pre-wired to have biases. For example, say that you have a baby, 2-week-old baby, and every time this baby sees a particular person's face, they either get fed or they get hugged or they get some comfort or something positive happens. And then they see another face, and those results or those outcomes are not experienced. That baby is going to prefer to see the face where the food and comfort and love is coming from. So even as infants, we are pre-wired for associations between individuals or even groups and traits. They can be quite functional. So not all biases are inherently bad. Depending on the situation, some biases can be appropriate, self-protective, and quite functional. So if you're a parent who takes care of your own children in your household, that's good bias. That's what we call good kid bias, right? They're in your house, you provide food, clothes, and shelter for your kids. Let's say you're a hiring manager and you're hiring for a position, and your kids are grown up, and you're hiring for a position where one of your children is applying, and there's 7 other people more qualified than your child, but you hire your child anyway. That's bad kid bias, right? Kid bias in the home, food, clothes, shelter for your own children. Understandable, we get it. It's cultural, it's functional, it's normative. Good kid bias. Kid bias at work, hiring an unqualified child, bad kid bias. Having bias towards your child in and of itself is not inherently bad. Depending on the situation, however, it can have negative outcomes. So the question is not, do we have biases? If you are human, you have bias. It comes with the machinery of your mind, not the content of your character. So if you're a human being, everybody on the call, go ahead and embrace, you're going to have biases just because you're human. The question becomes, whatever biases you have, are they placing others at a disadvantage in a systematic way? So if I provide biased food, clothing, shelter for my own children in my own house, I'm not necessarily disadvantaging another group of people. But if I hire my unqualified child, I'm disadvantaging the other 7 applicants who are more qualified, and I'm undermining my organization's ability to meet its goals. Both of those situations involve bias towards your own child. But depending on the situations, the outcomes can vary. So that's a key point. We're going to have biases because we're human, but the impact of our biases on others depends on the roles we play in society and how we're positioned in society. Because in this work, and you all will find, just by mentioning the phrase implicit bias, some people become very defensive and they think you're calling them a bad person. What I'm talking about today is how your mind works. The machinery of your mind will lock in biases and you won't even know it's happening. And you can still be a good person. Okay. All right. Next slide. So this one should be, what is implicit bias? Is that correct, Niobli? I think I'm on mute. All right. I think the next slide is, what is implicit bias? Is that correct, Niobli? Are we still good? Can you all still hear me?
We can hear you, Bryant, and it is what is implicit bias.
Okay, all right, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Okay. So now to work toward sort of a formal definition of implicit bias, so that, you can have this, going forward, I think it'd be helpful to sort of, and you all have the slide deck. So this is sort of a formal definition. Now this definition, you go to the next slide where it says implicit bias defined. So implicit bias refers to stereotypes that affect our attitudes, understanding, actions, and decisions. In decisions in an unconscious manner. These biases, which encompass both favorable and unfavorable assessments, are activated involuntarily and without an individual's awareness or intentional control. So this definition is from the Kirwan Institute at Ohio State University. So there are 2 or 3 major definitions of implicit bias. This is one of them. It's pretty solid. What I would add to this definition is that implicit bias can happen at 3 different levels. It can happen at the thinking level, which is a stereotype, where you associate a trait with a group. It can happen at the feeling level, where you dislike somebody, or it can happen at the behavior level or discrimination level, where it involves observable, measurable behavior. So those are sort of the 3 different levels, key levels at which implicit bias can function. Next slide. In terms of implicit bias finding, what the researchers have found over the last several years is that we all have implicit biases, but again, the impact of our biases on others depends on the roles we play in society. Implicit bias, next bullet point. So these bullet points are going to come one at a time, unless the whole slide is showing. I'm not sure, but you could just show all the bullet points if they're coming up one at a time. So the second bullet point is implicit bias is more prevalent than explicit bias because our minds are cognitive machines that encode and store many associations between groups and traits that we have not consciously processed. So we have all types of biases towards numbers, towards shapes, towards colors. If I ask you all your favorite letter, it will probably be part of your first name or your last name. So to have bias in a variety of areas is quite normal and natural. You can call them preferences. Some folks do. But the notion is we all have them. In the U.S., it's pretty interesting that the propensity for us when we see other human beings at an automatic implicit level, we automatically categorize them according to race, gender, and age, just automatically without even thinking about it. In the U.S., this is something that we do. Implicit bias is a stronger predictor of day-to-day behavior than explicit bias because much of our behavior and thoughts are automatic. It doesn't require much effortful processing. And finally, the potential impact of implicit bias on behavior can be overridden by conscious effort. So just because you sort of take a test, you take the implicit associations test or some other measure of implicit bias and find that you have certain biases towards a particular group, that doesn't mean that you're locked into that bias, that you'll mistreat that group or dislike that group. It just means that you've been overexposed to an association of a trait with that particular group. Okay. And so we would, if you can flash the next slide, Niobli, I don't know if it'll work or not, but if you can try to flash the next slide.
Yep. We're flashing it now. Yep, it's flashing now.
Okay. So if they flash the next slide, if you all looking at the screen, many people when they flash it saw an elderly couple, an older man and an older woman looking at each other. Okay. But when Niobli shows it again, you can show it again and leave it up. All right, when he shows it again, you'll see that, and actually looking at it in detail, you're seeing actually 5 individuals there. So if you stare at that image and count them out, you'll actually see 5 people. That's the implicit explicit distinction. So the implicit is that image with all 5 people was there the very first time you saw it, right? The image did register in your occipital lobe, the part of your brain responsible for vision, did see the image, okay? But you didn't have time to process it. So you sensed it, but you did not perceive it. Perception adds meaning to sensation. But when I gave you time to process and look at it, you saw all 5 people. So what we must understand is that anytime you're awake, that you have both a unconscious and conscious level of processing going on. The unconscious would be when I flashed and you saw the 2, and the conscious would be when I left it up there. Well, we left it up there and you can see all 5. All right, next slide. Okay. So common biases and targets. And common biases and targets. So those first 2 that you're seeing on the screen. So most biases arise from external characteristics such as race or gender. Also, Arabs and Muslims or ethnicity and religion is also a common target of bias in the U.S. So prejudice towards this group really exploded since 9/11. Next bullet point. So people are overweight, common target of bias. The LGBTQ communities, common target of bias. Undocumented individuals, common target of bias. But America's strongest negative bias is actually toward the elderly, followed by the obese. So in the U.S., we have a pretty strong pro-youth bias. We strongly prefer the younger versions of ourselves and of others. And on the opposite end, that translates to a bias towards the elderly. And that's regardless if you're Black, white, Native American, Hispanic, male, female, rich or poor. In the U.S., all of us will become elderly at some point. And when we think about the elderly versions of ourselves, negative traits tend to come to mind. And so it's a pretty universal negative bias in the U.S. is the elderly piece. All right, next slide. So what does implicit bias look like in the real world? And so here we're going to talk about measurement. Next slide. So when you think about, you can advance to the next slide. When you think about implicit bias in terms of how it can be measured, there's a
Bryant, this is Niobli.
Yeah.
I just want to make sure we're on the right slide. What slide? Are you on everyday bias?
Yeah, I thought there was a slide that defined the implicit associations test. But if that's not there, then that's fine. Okay. So it's not there. That's my fault. But in terms of what you all can do in terms of measuring implicit bias, everyone should write this down. The implicit associations test, that is a measure of implicit bias at the thinking level, at group and trait. It does not deal with feelings. It does not deal with behavior. It deals with the extent to which you associate certain traits with a particular group relative to other groups. So the implicit associations test. And if you just Google that, The first two links that pop up, one will say Project Implicit, the other one will say implicit.harvard.edu. Both of those links will take you to the same site. It is a Harvard-based site. Once you get there, there are over 30 different tests that you can take in terms of measuring your implicit bias towards particular groups. Each one of those tests are 10 to 12 minutes. Okay. Okay, next slide.
So, Brian, what does implicit bias look like in the real world?
Okay, what does implicit bias look like in the real world? Okay, next slide. So everyday bias in terms of some examples. So tall employees receive higher wages than their shorter counterparts. Qualifications being equal, that is credit score, financial history, income, etc. Blacks and Hispanics are less likely to be approved for home mortgages and paid higher interest rates on loans when they were approved. Previous performance being equal, kindergarten through 12th grade teachers have lower expectations and display less social comfort with African American students than with white students. Okay, next slide. Okay, yeah, there's going to be 3 bullet points there as well. People who show implicit bias towards Latinos are more likely to oppose both illegal and legal immigration. Symptoms being equal, African Americans are less likely to receive the most effective treatment for illnesses, even after matching them on income and insurance coverage. And finally, and this one is particularly compelling, regular weight job applicants were less likely to be recommended to be hired for a job when they were seen in a photo sitting next to an obese applicant than when they were seen sitting alone or next to a regular weight person. So this sort of demonstrates the ecosystem of bias, how it can take place in all sorts of areas. But research supports all of this. Okay, next slide. Okay. So this was a video we want to show, but due to time, we want to be respectful of folks' time. But in this video, basically, this young man, his real name is Jose. He lives in LA area, and he tells a story about applying for a lot of jobs online and on different sites using his first full name, Jose. And then he talks about applying as Joe. So he took the S out of his first name. So instead of Jose, he became Joe. And his job prospects increased exponentially. He was getting no bites when he was Jose, but then when he changed it to Joe, a lot of interest came up. So that's a bias when it comes to name. And the thing is, people on the receiving end of his resume, they may not even know that the name Jose is working against him. They may be good, well-meaning people who don't know that a name is having a negative impact. Okay, next slide. And so when taking numerous factors into account, for example, the seriousness of the primary offense or number of prior offenses, black males with the most prominent Afrocentric features, that is to say dark skin, wide nose, full lips, were most likely to receive longer sentences from judges, receive death penalty convictions from juries when the victim was white, not when the victim was black, and be mistaken for a suspect by police. So this sort of work has been replicated by several researchers, and it's pretty compelling as well. Next slide. So this is another video, and in this video, we want to show you a replication of the Kenneth and Mimi Clark doll studies, where they had black children look at black and white dolls and indicate their preference. As many of you all know and have seen clips of this before, you had children pretty much ages 4, 5, and 6 preferring a white doll over a black doll, saying that the white doll was nicer, was smarter, and was prettier, things like that. And this is when we talk about the impact of implicit bias on the target, the person on the receiving end. So for some children in our society, due to what they're exposed to, what they see in the media day in and day out, they may begin at a very early age to associate positive traits with one group and negative traits with another group, even if the negative traits are towards their own group. And that can happen as early as 3 or 4 years old. Okay, next slide. Okay, so when we talk about the causes of implicit bias, next slide. There are a few different causes. And again, all this has significant research here. So I think there are going to be 3 or 4 you can just put on the screen. Okay, so the minimal group effect, in-group favoritism occurs even when group membership is random. All this is saying is that we're built to connect with other people, and we tend to have positive bias towards our in-group and not towards the out-group. Bias and self-esteem basically says that bias can be self-affirming, and if other groups are seen as inferior by an individual, then one can conclude that I must be superior. So people feel good if they're in the superior group. Next is rationalization for oppression. The powerful groups can retain power through the use of stereotypes and prejudices, where regardless of your society, if you see another group as inferior and you may want to help them, but you can rationalize in your own mind, well, maybe they are different than us, then that oppression can continue. All right, next slide. Categorization, so our mental tendency to group things, including people. So people are biased because we categorize each other according to race, gender, and age. Socialization and exposure, so we learn to be biased from our teachers, peers, media, and personal experience. Some would say the evolution survival strategy that some bias is self-protective. So over time, going back to our earliest days on the planet, it was in our reproductive interest to have certain biases. And then lack of exposure to the diversity within other groups. So not knowing enough about, generalizing a group to all be the same rather than understanding the diversity that exists within their group can lead us to be biased as well. Next slide. All right. Oh, okay. So, all right. So I'm good on my time then. So basically, that's sort of an overview in terms of what is implicit bias, what it looks like in the real world, and why it exists. And I'm sorry again for the sort of background noise initially. I'm in travel, and it's one of those days where I'm multitasking to the maximum. But hopefully I'll have a few seconds to answer some questions through the chat box, and I'll turn it back over to Niobli and Samia.
Awesome, Bryant. So I think some of the chat questions are going to come through, and so I'll give you maybe one or two for you to answer now, and then we'll go into our section. So the first one says, what are some resources to help others learn about implicit bias?
Okay. One resource I would say in terms of what they can read a book called Blind Spot, like a blind spot, by Mahzarin Banaji and Anthony Greenwald. If you read that book, it's on Audible and you can get it on Amazon. Blind Spot. It gives you an excellent overview of the research around implicit bias. Okay. Then also read a book called Thinking Fast and Slow. Thinking Fast and Slow is the title. If you go on Amazon, it'll pop right up. And those two books are really sort of foundation pillar type reading. And then I would also recommend going to a website, the Kirwan Institute. If you Google Kirwan, spelled Kirwan Institute, implicit bias, if you put in that phrase, their site will come up. And the Kirwan Institute is sort of a one-stop shop for implicit bias. It'll have a lot of resources that you need. And finally, I'm sorry about the background noise. Finally, if you, when you take the implicit associations test, the website that you go to will have a wealth of resources. There are articles there. There are frequently asked questions. There are other recommendations. So that's a full-bodied website as well. When you take the implicit associations test, just click on the link that says research, and there'll be a breadth of information that you can explore.
Got it. Thank you, Bryant. We really appreciate that overview. And now we're going to transition to just spend a little time talking about like how bias shows up in our work. Bryant did a great job of introducing the topic of what bias is. And each of those things he listed, Sarah and Molly have put some of those in the chat group. We also can follow up and send direct links to them all. But it's an ever-changing landscape around the science. The Kirwan Institute that Brian mentioned puts out a report every single year about the latest in the science. And so there are researchers who are looking at how this is changing. But I really want to transition and just spend the rest of the time talking about how this shows up in our work. Most of you all are involved in policy and environmental change campaigns across the country. And maybe some of the things that Brian said was a trigger to you. And so my first question for you is, you can actually see it in front of you. But do you recognize how bias is showing up in your organization or your work? And if it is, if you did the texting, we're going to do a quick poll. If the answer is yes, just based from the one-on-one that Bryant gave. If bias is showing up in your organization or your work, say yes. Or if you feel that it's not at all, say no. You can also say that based off the brief introduction. And as you can see in full scale, 70% of you are saying yes. 75, okay, well, it's changing. 70-30. We're going to stay with 70-30. And we're going to come back to that at the end of the call because we're posing that question now before talking directly about your work. So after hearing the basic science, quick one-on-one, I believe that was less than 20 minutes of content, 80% of you say that you may be able to recognize it. And 19% of you, 81 say you can, 18% say you can't. So we're going to go back into our deck now and see if the answer to that changes by the end of the call. And so one of the first ways that I think bias shows up for those of us in public health work is the beginning of bias is how we name and call out the communities we work in. And as practitioners in conferences in our materials, you'll see a few of the words that we use: vulnerable communities, high risk, low income, low resource, most in need, rural, urban, minority. What's interesting about this is before we even have a conversation about what bias is, the language that we use helps inform how we view this. And so imagine if someone from a completely different sector was learning about the work you do, non-public health background, and the first way that you unpacked the issues that you're dealing with were with these words, imagine the bias that would register. And so I'm calling this out for us, not because, by the way, we use these words as well, but what I want to emphasize is that the language is the beginning of bias for us involved in active living and healthy eating and et cetera. And so we need to maybe have a different conversation about how we name and call those communities that we all care about. Second question I have for folks, and this is going to be another poll. So imagine you are preparing to do an assessment of park access in a neighborhood. You're getting ready to survey those in and around the areas to talk about usage. Again, we're going to go Scouts Honor. In the same text group, if the first people that you would reach out to is picture number 1, then drop 1 in the text polling. If the first group that you would reach out to is someone that would be in and around picture 2, put 2 in the polling. Or if you would go to 3, the picture in 3, put that in the polling. And we're going to go to the results to see. Just your honest assessment. You're getting ready to do an assessment of a park. You want to find out what's happening in the community. Who are you most likely to go to? So y'all are good. Nice. And if we were talking to each other, I would hope that the reason that you would go to number 1 first is because you feel that they would have context. Now let's talk about how bias impacts how we see and view vulnerable communities. See, I just said vulnerable. So I told you that I'm proof of what's happening. And so the idea is that going to any of these individuals or these places in the picture, none of them are completely wrong or completely right. In fact, you want to talk to everyone in these pictures. But one of the things that bias, how it plays out in our organizations is who are we most likely to go to first, and then who are the people that we work with are more likely to go to. One of the conversations we've been having at We-Collab is really understanding how we build in capacity in the field beyond those of us on this webinar. And so if you're on this webinar, you're probably in management or higher up. You may be frontline and field staff, but most of the training and technical assistance goes to leadership. So the question is, I can ask the question differently, which we won't do, but if we went to your most frontline field employee, would they still say that they would go to the first group? And so this then leads to how does bias impact who we see in the community? Often the people in the first picture may have some of the best information about what's happening in and around the park. And so for us, how do we use bias to make sure that we're not only seeing the people who have access in the community, but that we're training our staff and our organizations to engage with them and to work with them, irregardless of what our bias says? The second picture, which is the bodega store. Often, again, when we're thinking about public health interventions, we need to find a way to make sure that our bias doesn't stop us from seeing the value in the people in unlikely places. And so, again, I would ask the question is, do we see the clerk behind the store counter as viable person in our field that can contribute to our work? And what happens, the way that bias plays out is sometimes our biases are reinforced. And so you may be thinking, well, I have tried to do that. It didn't work. And the question is, like, what were your rules of engagement? Like, how did you approach them? And we're going to say more about that later. The second area we want to talk about real briefly is how bias shows up in our coalitions and our partnerships. This is my favorite one, because it makes us think about a few questions. You know, who do we invite to our coalitions? Who are the first people that it's most likely for us to be in community with? Second question is, what assumptions are made about their capabilities, expertise, and trust? And the last one asks, how do power dynamics play out? So I'm going to stay on the first bullet for a moment here. One of the things that we've been working on with some of the groups that we work with is that a lot of our coalitions are practitioner heavy. And in order to actually get to a change in outcomes, which is what I believe that we're all striving for in our organization, is a change in outcomes, we should be enlisting those who are direct beneficiaries of the work we do. So if you look around your coalition table or the people you're most likely to work with, the question I was asked is, do you see the people that you want to impact showing up in your work? And if you don't, what assumptions were made about people who are not there or their capabilities? Or do you trust them? And again, the reason that this may not be happening is because unintentional bias. We don't all wake up and say, I don't want grassroots or frontline people in my organization, but based off our training, how we grew up, our experience, all the things that Bryant talked about, we may have default settings about who we reach out to. And so bias can help open up discussions with your staff and with your peers about who should be sitting at the table with you. The same thing goes to the assumptions about their capabilities and expertise and trust. Now, that's more about the external field. What I actually want to talk about more is our internal field as practitioners and those that we work with. So I have a question about how do power dynamics play out within our organization. So it's interesting. Bryant said that the strongest form of bias that exists in our society is based on age. And I want to pause here for a moment because that actually correlates with what is happening in the workforce right now. As you can see, it's a very simple chart from Pew. In 1994, we had 3 different groups represented in the labor force. Most of those were Gen Xers who were just starting off most of those were baby boomers who had been in the industry for a while. A large percentage of those after baby boomers were Gen Xers who were just getting started. And then the smallest but a significant group of individuals was the silent or the greatest generation. But today, you have more generations represented in the workforce at one time than has ever happened before in this country. So you have post-millennials, you have millennials, you have Gen Xers, you have boomers, and then you have the greatest generation. So connecting that to the point that Bryant made about who we have the strongest bias against, I would just ask that we need to start thinking about the dynamics within our organization and how millennials interact with Gen Xers and how everyone interacts with baby boomers. Again, we know that there's a bias there. And if you think about power dynamics and power structures, how are we empowering people across different areas? And I'm not saying this to state that negative intentions are going in one direction or the other. What I am trying to say is that bias impacts how all these organizational tactics play out, which is related to another topic at We-Collab that we wrestle with a lot, is really this binary process of how we do our work. There's ways that we set our work up within our organizations. There's institutional questions we ask about how we're situated, and then the answer to those questions determine what we do externally in our work and in community. And so this graph that I'm showing you is more about the internal aspects, about how we're looking at age dynamics and how bias can be impacting that. The other aspect that I want to actually call out here, now I'm going back to external, we're going to kind of jump back and forth, is are we allowing the different age dynamics of our advocates to like tell their stories and their experiences? And so not only just when you think about your coalitions, but when you think about the people who speak behalf on the issues, if there's a testimony at City Hall or at the state legislature, are we making sure that those representatives in the state capitol truly see the full representation of what community looks like. Again, it's real easy to take the usual suspects with us when we're going to advocate, but are we taking the time to think about a more broader spectrum and making sure that bias isn't coming into that? And thank you for that question. I'm actually going to pause for a second. You're absolutely right. The question is that a function of breaking generations into smaller chunks, or people living and working longer? And you're absolutely right. It is both. People are entering the workforce sooner and they're staying in the workforce later. And that's an entire different webinar about why that is happening. But because of that dynamic, because people are retiring later, which that's actually scheduled to continue, people are going to stay in the workforce even later. And because people are coming into the workforce sooner, that's contributing to these dynamics. So the last area, and I'm going to do this so we can really dive into some Q&A for the last 10 minutes. And both Bryant, if he's still there, and Sarah and Sumi, we're all going to be here to jump in. But I do want to leave time to really read some of these questions and have discourse and then talk about next steps. And so as you can see the slide on policy and implementation, again, all this is through the frame of how does bias impact this. And so Bryant set this up in terms of like what bias is 101 and a little bit of science. We talked about the language we use. We talked about our coalitions. Now we're talking about policy and implementation. So if bias is impacting your work, you may ask the question of who gets the funding, either at the organizational table in a coalition, but that question by itself is full of bias. To remove bias or to ask a more appropriate question would be who needs or could benefit from funding, because it's not making an assumption that the default setting for funding is just one way. Also, the idea of who has capacity. This is my favorite one. So another one of my favorite ones, and so I'm going to stay here for a second, is often, and we have experienced this in rooms, where folks will say, well, that organization doesn't have capacity. And then based off bias, like, well, what's your definition of capacity? So a more appropriate question that an aware, competent organization and individual will wrestle with is what type of capacity is needed here? Because everybody has capacity to do something well. You apply different lenses for the work that needs to happen in community, and we have to make sure that the question about who has capacity is not a way that we're excluding people, but that the second half of that question, what type of capacity is needed here, makes room for everyone at the table. And at different times, you'll need different things. And so this is about building muscle to make sure that we're not excluding folks, because a lot of what we're talking about, bias writ large, is about being more inclusive and raising an awareness so we can call out things. And when we were talking with Sarah before this webinar, another way that we like to talk about bias and define it further is that many of you have gotten past the health equity one-on-one conversations and discussions. I would argue that this is actually moving you to the next level because it's giving you something to wrestle with that's a little bit deeper. And then all of this collectively is how you operationalize equity and health equity, is by going deeper. The last bullet on the slide, which I also talked about previously, is who do you trust? And then a more aware or a different way to ask that question is who do the partners in the communities trust for this work? And I'm going to pause here for a second because I think I've said community a few times on this call, and I just want to define in what context I'm discussing community. So what I am not talking about when I say community is the community of folks on this phone right now. Many of you have worked with each other. Many of you are in coalitions together, but most of us are practitioners, informed practitioners. When we say community, we're talking about the geographic area that is actually who and where you want to see impact happen. And so when we say in community, we're not talking about practitioners in the public health field and the foundations. We're talking about the south side of Chicago. We're talking about East and West Oakland. We're talking about Third Ward in Houston, Texas. We're talking about North Detroit. And I say that to call out because we say community a lot. And when we talk about bias, we need to make sure that when we say bias affecting the community, that we're not talking to ourselves, but we're talking about the places where we want to see impact. And so, I'm going to stop and take another question, and then I'm going to combine that answer also in our wrap-up slide. But the question says, how do we start to change policy and procedures within organizations when the decision-making flow and power structure is so ingrained? We need to change how we do business to impact bias in our work, but this is very difficult. And I suspect many leaders cannot and won't take the steps to be courageous and try something different. Ditto, ditto, ditto. You're absolutely right. And so I'm going to take a moment to address that, because even to engage in a discussion about bias is a representation of a certain level of consciousness. And so then how do you move people there? One of the ways that we've been having discussions with people, and I think this will make sense for most of you all, is that many of us have taglines in our missions, our vision statements, and our objectives about who we're serving. And often we'll see that 3-letter word that says all children. And what we've been having discussions with people is that how do they define the all? And just to tell you a quick story about how we did exactly the question you just posed to, is that you posed to us, is that we were working with an organization, and all children was in their mission statement. And we started asking them, how do you know you're impacting all children? So we presented a very specific set of questions that was meant to make the organization ask deep questions about themselves. And in an all-staff meeting, what we found out, this is interesting, is that everyone knew what health equity was. Everyone agreed that they were doing it, but there was no evidence within the organization of how do you know that work is happening. And so in talking about mission, vision, we're not asking organizations to change their mission and vision statements, but we are asking what value system is in place for you to make decisions across the continuum that's evidence that you have this competency. And so with the staff and with the senior leadership, we actually just facilitated discussion, and with the staff came up with a value system that exactly when they got to a position, when the organization reached a hard place where it had to make a decision in leadership, the leadership and everyone in the room agreed, we're going to go to our value system first. And so to answer your question in short, my question would be, what's the accountability? Is there a value system in place that allows people to understand like when they need to make decisions based off the hierarchy? And then the other question is, how are folks communicating information up? I will say, not in defense of leadership of some organizations, but a lot of what we've seen is that senior leadership is just not aware of some of these dynamics. And so what communication channels are in play that allow information to go back and forth? I could go really, really long there, but I'm not. But we will provide an opportunity for follow-up on that. So let's just round this off real quickly. Next slide. So in order to reduce the impact of bias in our work, like what are things that we need to do? Very easy, direct starting places. And for one is that, recognize that bias exists. It's not a blame game. It's not finger pointing, but science says we all have it. It's how our brain sorts the world. And so when we ask the question at the very beginning, everyone has bias. If you haven't recognized it yet, doesn't mean it doesn't exist. But all of us are full of bias. One of the things we want folks to understand is that they need to be more introspective and honest about why we have certain opinions. And so a lot of this is about organizational culture. Starting to ask ourselves why we use the language we use. Is there another set of language that we can use every time we say X to make sure that people know who and what we're talking about? We have to create opportunities for interactions and authentic conversations with different groups of people. Bryant made it very, very clear the number one way to address bias is exposure. And so if your organization and your partners and your staff are all homogeneous, then you need to look at other ways of diversifying the table you sit around. And we don't just mean diversity from race and ethnicity, but across the spectrum, honing in on what we said earlier about age. Training and routine exercises. We can't emphasize how important training is. It is the only way that our brains are expanded around the issue. Training and exercise. It should be part of staff meetings. There are quick things you can do. The Implicit Bias Association test is a great exercise for you to take back and start with your staff. And then the last one, and this is the one that we use every single day, is we check ourselves about our decisions and our opinions. We're always checking ourselves. Like when we walk in a room, what assumptions have we made about why folks are there and what they stand to get from? And what we need to do is always try to get to a place where we have a blank slate. Give someone a chance, before you build bias. Like let the playing field be equal before you start. We are really, really short on time. And so I want folks to throw a couple questions in the chat box, and we'll try to address them. This does not have to be the end of this conversation. Pardon us for starting off a little shaky today, but if you have further questions, feel free to send them to info@we-collab.com. It's right in front of you for those of you on the internet, and to info@we-collab.com. We can work with Bryant to get other questions out to you. I know Safe Routes to School is committed to this work, as well as Voices for Healthy Kids. And so we hope to go deeper with you. But I do want to take a second to just, if there's any parting questions or things you want us to take away to make sure there's some type of follow-up, you can go ahead and drop them in there. And I'm actually going to scroll back and see if there's any questions I missed, because I know there are some that I did.
Well, I just want to say, Niobli, this is Bryant. I'm still on the phone. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead, please.
I just wanted to say, yeah, I have to get ready to go, but everything that Niobli said, I fully endorse 1,000%. I think the fact that you all are having this conversation in the national context is critical. We all know that, it's happening at Starbucks today with that context. And so in healthcare and in health disparities, many of you all know that this research around racial disparities has been going on for decades. But the fact we're having a conversation, the fact that it's top of mind, and you all are trying to organize and coordinate in a way that can sort of more systematically address the issue without making people feel guilty, because part of the challenge in this work, people are resistant because when you tell them they have implicit bias, they become defensive. But if you talk about it as a universal human phenomenon that we all have, they are more open to it. But please, that doesn't give them a pass. So just because it's implicit doesn't mean, oh, well, it's implicit, I can't do anything about it, it's okay. As it was already stated, yes, we have these biases, but once we acknowledge their existence and we can see them in terms of measuring disparities, we have to do something about them. So please do not let your colleagues off the hook by saying it's implicit, I don't have to do anything. It's more like, well, it's implicit, we know there's disparities, let's do something. So yeah, I appreciate all the energy that you all are putting into this. And I just encourage you all to stay on the grind. Many of you all are on the front line. I know the work is hard, and every day you may not get the appreciation or even a compensation that you deserve, but in due time, it'll be worth it.
Thank you so much for that, Brian. I think folks on the line will appreciate that. And I know you have to sign off. We have one more minute. I'll make a closing comment, but thank you, and we'll make sure folks can reach out if they need to.
All right. Bye-bye.
So just in closing, I want to wrap this up, that bias is definitely not something you solve in a 1-hour webinar where there's technical difficulties. So that's one. Second is that you all have to be the change agents that start this conversation in your organizations. Some of you may or may not have support from leadership. I would say that we have to all manage up no matter where we are, whether it's the director managing up to the board or frontline managing up to those ahead of them. But we have to start to insert these conversations, because a lot of what we want to see about health equity is not about what needs to change in the community or from an intellectual discussion on disparities, but it's about our organizations and our readiness. And implicit bias is laser focused on adjusting internal readiness in an organization to then meet the field exactly where they are and with the resources that they need. I think that's really important to call out. We're committed to that work. Again, I just want to thank Sarah from Safe Routes to School Partnership and the Voices for Healthy Kid Initiative. Any questions, scenarios, comments, critique, send it to info@we-collab.com. We'll do our best to get back as soon as possible. But this needs to be an ongoing discussion. So it may have been the first time some of you were talking about it, but it definitely won't be the last. Thanks again, and have a wonderful week, folks. Appreciate you.